In our message last Lord's Day, we talked about the issue of boundaries against the backdrop of Laban and Jacob deciding to pile up a bunch of rocks that came to be called the heap of witness, to set a boundary where Jacob would live on one side, Laban on the other, in order to avoid conflict. We talked about boundaries, we talked about conflict, and we're going to talk about those things even more today on Beyond the Notes. This sort of articulation, this organized list of laws that have to do with boundaries has to be honestly attributed to its source. The excellent book, which originally came out way back in 1992, the version that I have here is a 2017 version of Boundaries by Henry Cloud and Townsend. I forgot his first name, John Townsend. Cloud and Townsend's Boundaries is a classic, and it deserves to be for what it's worth. And in chapter 5 of that book, they get round to articulating what they pronounce as sort of 10 laws around the issue of boundaries. Now remember, and if you were with us on Lord's Day, you got this definition. If you weren't, here it is. A boundary is simply a clear communication of relationship expectations. Rather than allowing our relationships to suffer because we won't clearly communicate reasonable expectations for the relationship, or in some cases even have expectations for the relationship, our relationships suffer and get weird. We covered 5 of the laws of boundaries because there were 5 of them that were very clearly reflected in the text of Genesis 31, 43 through 55. But there were 5 additional laws, and I made the statement in that message that we'd be addressing those additional laws this week on Beyond the Notes, and so here we are. There are principles of relationships that are just real. That's what these laws are. Let me go through them, the ones that I didn't cover. The first is the law of sowing and reaping. Now, it functions in 2 ways in our relationships, and 2 ways that really have to do with boundaries. The first and most fundamental, and this is the law of the harvest. It's articulated in the book of Galatians in the Bible. Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. And on a surface level, that means that your actions have consequences. And by now, if you're old enough to listen to a podcast, by now you've figured that out, that actions have consequences. But here's the more fundamental issue when we consider boundaries and the law of the harvest, the law of sowing and reaping. The more fundamental issue in relationships and boundaries is the law of the harvest can be interrupted. The law of gravity holds that if I hold a glass above the floor and I drop it, the glass is going to fall and hit the floor. Well, that can be interrupted. It might be that somebody else, as I let the glass go, it could be that somebody else swoops in and catches it. And the law of gravity that would predict that the glass would be shattered on the floor is interrupted and the glass doesn't break. In relationships, we can interrupt the consequences in other people's lives. We can interrupt the process of sowing and reaping. Some psychologists call this codependent behavior, where I will jump between someone and their consequences over and over and over again. If you spend way too much money all the time, a consequence of that is supposed to be that you run out of money and have to really rearrange some stuff. But if every time you overspend, somebody sends you $1,000, then you will never learn not to overspend. The law of sowing and reaping says we should set boundaries in such a way that the people in our lives get to learn about consequences. We should not have a life that has no boundary around others and their consequences. I cannot have effective boundaries and constantly be short-circuiting the law of cause and effect, or the law of sowing and reaping, or the law of the harvest, whatever you want to call it, in the lives of people that I care about. I have to be willing to let others around me become acquainted with their own consequences. That's the law of sowing and reaping. Doesn't mean that you can't occasionally be kind to someone. Doesn't mean that you're not there in love to occasionally help someone who is placed into a bind. But you cannot consistently and persistently be short-circuiting consequences in the lives of everyone around you, or your life will lack effective boundaries and you'll end up angry, bitter, overstretched. The next law that we didn't talk about on Sunday, we'll talk about now, is the law of responsibility. The law of responsibility simply says that you are responsible for your own feelings, your own attitudes, and your own behaviors. You are responsible for your own feelings, attitudes, and behaviors. Conversely, you are not responsible for other people's feelings, attitudes, and behaviors. And here's the kicker: nobody else is responsible for your feelings, attitudes, and behaviors. Those are on you. Oftentimes in counseling, I'll have someone lead with a sentence, well, they make me feel blah, and I usually interrupt them and say, you know what? No, they don't. No one can make you feel anything. You are responsible for your own feelings. Now, they may be pursuing a course of action that tends to stir up certain feelings in you. The issue is the course of action they are pursuing, and you're allowed to speak to that course of action and seek to see a different boundary in place. But it is a cop-out when you claim that someone else is responsible for your emotional state. No one else is responsible for your emotional state, and you are not responsible for anyone else's emotional state. Wait a minute, Brother Russell, it sounds like that you're saying we ought to be uncaring robots. No, we're human beings, and we're going to have feelings, and the people around us are going to have feelings. And ideally, we should be somewhat aware of the feelings of those around us. But awareness of the feelings of those around us is not the same as taking responsibility for other people's feelings, attitudes, behaviors. The law of responsibility says, I need to be responsible where I am responsible, and you need to be responsible where you are responsible. Third is the law of power. The law of power involves intentionally considering, as you think about boundaries, what you can control and what you can't. It's very similar to the law of responsibility, but the law of power says I have certain variables in my life I cannot manage. Thus, I do not need to burden myself with the duty to manage them. I cannot control whether or not it pours down rain this afternoon. I can control whether I thought about the possibility of rain such that I kept umbrellas handy, or at least an umbrella handy. If you've got a situation that you feel powerless against, sometimes, again, in counseling or conversations, I've worked with people who have felt powerless against sin in their life. And it's been good to remind them that you do have the power to repent. You have the power to seek to tell yourself the truth about what's going on and not lay it off to excuses and rationalizations. You do have the power to repent. You have the power to ask others to help you examine what's going on in your life and help you think more clearly about it. You should exercise the power that you have. One of my favorite stories regarding addiction, I've told it before. My grandfather, Stedman, my mom's dad, was a serious smoker. He was a law enforcement officer in the 40s and 50s and smoked a lot. One day in the late 60s, in response to thinking about the Surgeon General's report and that smoking was a cancer causer, my papa decided, to quit smoking. And his way of quitting was he took a half-finished carton of cigarettes off the mantle of his fireplace and put it in the fire, and up it went, and that was that. And from that day on, he never smoked again. Well, that was a different time, and the rhetoric of the complexities of addiction was not as much a part of his life. His first name was Carl, and in times after that, people would notice he was no longer smoking, and they would ask him, well, Carl, how'd you quit? And his response was classic. His response was, I stopped lighting them and sticking them in my mouth, and I found that pretty well did it. There's something there about the law of power. You have power. For example, in using smoking, you have the power to not light the things and stick them in your mouth. And admitting to yourself where you do have control is an important part of relating healthily with boundaries. Another one I didn't speak of, the fourth of the ones I'll talk about today, is the law of motivation. The law of motivation simply asks, why in my life do I need this boundary? What's driving me to set this boundary? Or what is driving me not to set a boundary in an area in my life where I need to. Perhaps, for example, you're chronically insecure at work. And so because you're chronically insecure at work, you fail to set boundaries around what belongs to your employer and what belongs to you. You always say yes to everything. You take on extra things until you're burning out, you're working too many hours, you're harming your relationships outside of the workplace, and it's all completely out of whack. But you're afraid that if you start saying no, they'll do bad things to you at work or about work. Tell the truth about your motive. Your motive is fear. Your motive is people-pleasing. Your motive is something other than your own long-term, sustainable, even performance in the workplace. You're probably on course to angry burnout. Years ago, I had a team member working with me in a setting. And it was my responsibility to see how this team member was doing. And so I would check up on this team member from time to time, and the team member always told me he was fine. I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. Then one day, this member of the team pretty much stormed into my office and pretty much chewed me out and unloaded a litany of all the things that he was very, very angry about. And I took it. What choice did I have? But at the end of it, I asked him, how about all those times that I asked you how you were doing and you said you were fine? Well, he didn't want to talk much about that. Clear thinking about boundaries will allow you to say in every setting, you know what, that's not workable for me. I'm not going to take that on. Or in a marriage relationship or a family relationship, that conduct is not okay. Let's talk about it. We can set boundaries and have a motivation that is long-term sustainable health, not fear, not guilt, not people-pleasing. The law of motivation. And finally, the law of evaluation. The law of evaluation says that before I set a boundary, well, let me stop for a second. Some of you interact with this conversation about boundaries by making statements something along the lines of, boundaries aren't hard for me because I don't care what anybody else thinks anyway. Well, first, I hope you don't mean that. A person who absolutely cannot relate to the feelings of the people around them, there's a definition for that. It's a sociopath. If you have no connection at all to the feelings of the people around you, you're sociopathic, and that's kind of a problem. On the other hand, if you're so empathetically connected to the people around you that you can't make decisions or kind of feel on your own or think on your own, well, that's a problem too. The law of evaluation says before I put this boundary in place, before I articulate this expectation, it is wise for me to consider the impact on other people that this boundary might have. It might be the case that you're going to have to be prepared to hurt someone's feelings. By the way, that's not the end of the world. Hurting someone's feelings doesn't harm them. Hurting someone's feelings for a moment because of a boundary that needs communicating is way better than going on and on and on and on and on with something that is going to be unsustainable in a relationship. The joke I've made before is it's like the married couple, and there's something that's not right, and for whatever reason, the husband won't tell the wife that this is out of line, this won't work. And so he says he's okay, there's no problem. He's okay, there's no problem. He's okay, there's no problem. And the next thing you know, he stabs her in her sleep, and they're on a Dateline episode. When somebody had to be willing earlier in the relationship to risk a moment of hurt feelings to get the boundary talked about. The law of evaluation says weigh the cost, perhaps in momentary hurt feelings and discomfort, versus long-term resentment and real harm as you evaluate the importance of a given boundary. Now, here's what I've done. I've summarized over the course of a couple of communications, our message, and in this episode, one chapter of Cloud and Townsend's books. Look, I don't sell books for a living, and nobody's giving me a kickback, and I'm not asking for one. There are lots of different places you can get this book. It's readily available. I just think if these conversations have been interesting to you, check out Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend. And if the Beyond the Notes podcast is interesting to you, then please like it, subscribe, share it with your friends, and we will look forward to being with you next time on Beyond the Notes.